Okay, so it looks like it's time to get started. Welcome, everyone. So this is the start of the Vitis Gen 2 webinar series. And today's webinar, Europe is starting to embrace new disease-resistant varieties, will explore new attitudes and changing regulations surrounding what some consider as non-traditional grape varieties. This presentation is geared towards a non-scientific audience, but an understanding of viticulture is necessary for context. It is also more relevant to the perspective of attendees from North America, but we welcome all international guests. My name is Raquel Callis, and I am the Extension Support Specialist for the New York Statewide Viticulture Extension Program. I'm also part of the Extension and Outreach team for the Vitis Gen 2 project. So our panelists today are Tim Martinson and Bruce Reisch. Tim is Senior Extension Associate for the New York Statewide Viticulture Extension Program and leader of the Vitis Gen 2 Extension and Outreach team. Bruce is a professor of grape breeding and genetics at Cornell University and the project leader of Vitis Gen 2. And with that, I'll hand it over to Bruce.
Okay. Well, to start off with, we just wanted to let you know that this is a webinar that is supported by U.S. Department of Agriculture Specialty Crops Research Initiative grant to myself, Lance Cadle-Davidson, my co-lead from U.S. Department of Agriculture on this project. And this is the first webinar in the series. And it's run by our extension team, our very able extension team of Tim Martinson, Raquel Callis, and there are others on the extension team as well. The focus of Vitis Gen 2 is on the application of next generation technologies, primarily DNA and sequencing technologies, to accelerate grapevine cultivar development. So in a nutshell, let's see. In a nutshell, this project focuses on applying technological innovations in phenotyping, that's assessing characteristics of any particular trait of interest, and in genotyping, studying the genetics of grapevines to deliver breeding lines with durable powdery mildew resistance and very high fruit quality, and to better manage existing plantings. So we don't focus only on powdery mildew and resistance and high quality, but we have other traits of interest as well, downy mildew resistance and a range of other traits. We work on both wine grapes and seedless grapes within this project, raisin grapes, table grapes. The project is a 4-year project with about $6.5 million US dollars in funding. As I mentioned, it's from U.S. Department of Agriculture. Our team spans 10 different institutions across the United States, and it's carried out in coordination with a very important industry and science advisory panel. So with that background in mind, now I think we'll dig into the meat of the subject matter, and we'll go to Tim Martinson.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'm just okay. I'm just trying to share my screen here, and there we go. Okay, so I want to kick this off by talking about some of the background, and in particular, an article I wrote for Wines and Vines to sort of introduce the topic. Entitled The Frozen Genetics of International Wine Cultivars. And the main points I wanted to make in this article are, first of all, that all of our international wine cultivators have date from the Middle Ages and the middle of the Europe. And so since then, they've been undergoing vegetative propagation. So the genetics are really frozen back there in the Middle Ages. So this means that we have some notable weaknesses in these varieties, although we really like them for their wine quality attributes, and they're the basis of a worldwide industry. So the main weakness is susceptibility to diseases that came in from the New World. So all of these diseases and pests came into Europe well after these varieties were established in Europe. And of course, the famous one is grape phylloxera, which caused a great crisis in the 1800s, but also powdery mildew, downy mildew, and black rot. So these are things that didn't co-evolve with Vitis vinifera in Europe, and they're things that these varieties in general, to a greater or lesser extent, are highly susceptible to. And there's a lot of consequences. So I want to switch here to this evolutionary branching diagram that was published in by Juan et al. In 2013. So this is the result of a project also funded by the USDA, where they developed this, what we call the DNA SNP chip, a microarray that allowed them to simultaneously look for and score single nucleotide polymorphisms in, I think it's about 700 locations, if I have that right. So they use this to construct a phylogeny, talking about the genetic diversity and origin. So they looked at seveal accessions from Europe, a lot from China, from Asia, and then a number of different species from North America. So again, the big separation here is between muscadine in the southeastern United States and the U. vitis, what's considered to be U. vitis, the vitis genus. And the notable thing here is if we look at Europe, what they found through these accessions was about 3 groups, maybe 2 species of vitis there. So in Asia, we see 10 groups, 16 species. And in North America, we use 13 groups and 19 species. So all of our commercial international wine cultivars are derived from this sort of small slice of the genetic diversity that's out there. Here's another way of looking at it from an evolutionary tree. This paper hypothesized that the center of origin was really in North America, and you can see the branching diagrams, and over half this diagram is branching points in North America, another third in Asia, and you can see this one in Europe is a very, very small and modest point. So again, using the SNP chip, they also looked at relationships between grape cultivars, existing grape cultivars. And the thing to notice here is that there's a lot of very closely related species, and a lot of them are either siblings or have a parent-child relationship with each other. And it's a very tight and narrow genetic cluster. And again, this is all a cluster of grapevines that are not resistant don't have the disease resistance. So what's the consequences for this? Well, if we look at disease management in Chardonnay and look at the seasonal touchstones that we look at, if you're in arid production regions, you have powdery mildew and botrytis to worry about. If you're in the east or other more humid, you have these other diseases that you have to worry about. So in New York, in the Finger Lakes, what this means for growers of Chardonnay is that they have to do 13 fungicide applications. More properly, probably 10 to 15 or 18 fungicide applications. It's an enormous amount that we have to do just to produce clean, ripe, disease-free fruit. So recently, and I think Bruce will expand on this a little bit, some of our project advisory committee members from Europe have cited the fact that in many places in Europe, the vineyards are close by into towns, and this amount of fungicide applications is causing some concern among the populace. So part of the solution to this is to have disease-resistant cultivars available and accepted, so that at least in areas close to these towns, then perhaps those could substitute for the more intensively managed cultivars. And of course, a lot of this is going to come from germplasm from North American vitis, in which these various vitis species have co-evolved along with the pathogens that we introduced to Europe. So that's all I have to say with that. I'm going to pass it back over to Bruce.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm going to switch it over. Hold on a minute. Hang on, please. Okay.
Bruce, try pressing the full screen button down there at the bottom.
Yeah, that's the screen I've lost. Hold on a second. Okay.
We see your PowerPoint. It's just not full screen.
Oh, okay.
If that helps.
All right. Sorry about that.
It's okay.
How's that?
There you go. You got
okay.
it.
Okay. So I'm going to pick up the story here from Tim's mention of the development of hybrid grapes and some of the difficulties that were experienced in Europe in response to phylloxera invasion, powdery mildew, downy mildew, black rot, all diseases and insects endemic to North America, and unfortunately inadvertently exported in the 1860s and 1880s to Europe. The wine industry there was devastated, of course, with vinifera grapes not having resistance to phylloxera or these various fungal diseases. And in response, there was a great deal of innovation. Of course, they still wanted to grow grapes, make wine, grow all types of grape products possible. So there were innovations in disease control, innovations in grafting onto resistant rootstocks. And in the initial going, they also turned to hybridization, to the notion of using North American species that had co-evolved with these diseases as a source of resistance to the diseases and to phylloxera, and making what they called HDP, hybrid direct producers. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, Albert Seibel was one of the first innovators, shown here in the lower right, developing a large series of crosses with North American vitis and working very strongly in this area, developing large groups of hybrids such as the ones we know as Deschonach, Verdelet, Chelois, Chancellor. Often these were known by the breeder's name followed by a number, Seibel 7053, Chancellor. Then these are on this slide a few of the individuals who were involved in development of hybrid grapes in this period, late 1800s, early 1900s. Some of them are still grown, some of them are pretty nice in quality, but many were not considered to be high enough in wine quality to persist a long time. Some had the flavors and characteristics still of North American species like Vitis labrusca, Vitis riparia, Vitis estivalis. So there was still interest in returning to vinifera. And you can see how that charted out over the years. In the slide, I've borrowed some information I borrowed from Laurent Audeguin from France. You can see this topping out in terms of French-American hybrid production in France, 400,000 hectares in the 1950s or 60s. That's about 1 million acres, hectares to acres for a North American audience, multiplied by about 2.5 to get there. What surprised me actually by the numbers is that there are still 6,000 hectares of hybrid grapes, many of them French-American hybrid grapes, grown at practically at the present time in France. And this kind of piqued my interest when I saw this chart just a year and a half ago on a trip to France. And now we come back to this notion of what's happening nowadays in Europe and in France. And as you said, Tim, many vineyards are right there up against the towns. Many of these could be sprayed 10 to 20 times per year. And there's increasing concern about those pesticide applications right there next to the main streets of towns, next to homes, right next to the villages. So I became very interested in this topic. My interest was greatly piqued actually about 4 years ago when I spied this online in decanter.com. Bordeaux, Ducourt plants a disease-resistant vineyard. So this is a major holding in the Bordeaux region, producing high-quality Bordeaux wines, and they devoted about 3 hectares to planting 2 different grape varieties in 2014. So what are they? It's Cal 604 and Cabernet Jura, two grapes developed by a breeder in Switzerland, hybrids with vinifera and resistant breeding partners. Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, and Riesling are in the background of these grapes. And Ducourt was very interested in this. And going according to the letter of the law, he says in his website that we can plant at least 50 vines, and that's the upper limit, as long as the resulting wine is clearly labeled as experimental and bottled not under an appellation contrôlée label, but as a wine of France, typical geographic indication on this label. And if you start then researching a little bit more what's happened since 2014, you start traveling around the internet and you find articles about pesticide drift in French villages and a proposal to create a 200-meter exclusion zone around villages. I don't know exactly where that stands at this point, but there's a great deal out there. So what are these forces really that are driving change? First of all, you have these embedded vineyards, you have the cost of pesticide applications, the cost of fuel, the cost of labor, the environmental concerns, the health concerns. Many of these are shared not just by the population in general, but also by the growers themselves, increasingly concerned about pesticide applications and what else can they do to reduce and improve on the situation. In Europe, this is an especially sensitive topic because viticulture, according to a 2003 report I was able to find, viticulture uses about 40% of all crop protection products in all of agriculture in the European Union. So pictured here, I have a nice photo of Valentin Blattner's Cal 604, one of the white wine variety planted by Ducourt in Bordeaux. Sauvignon Blanc, Riesling, a resistant partner, unknown what that is. By now I figured there must be a wine out there, and there is. It's bottled under the label Métissage, first bottled in May 2017. This seminar will be recorded, so you'll be able to go back to these links, I think, and explore, read for yourself what's here. But to quote from the articles I'm finding, on the Ducourt website, we can tell you that the results are amazing. We spray very minimum in these vineyards once or twice a year, using only 1 copper one sulfur spray, using only copper and sulfur sprays. The vines are healthy, the resistance is stable, and the wines are good. So also at this meeting I attended in 2016 in Toulouse, it was the final conference of Innovine. So you can see all the presentations from Innovine on this website. Look up the proceedings of the final conference from 2016 from innovine.edu. And it was really interesting to me that not only did we have the 6,000 hectares quoted for France as hybrid grapes or disease-resistant grapes grown in Europe, but Italy, 10,000 hectares, Portugal, 8,000, Spain, 4,000, Germany, 3,000. Percentage-wise, these are pretty low numbers, but it's up to around 3% of all grapes grown in Germany that are hybrid disease-resistant grapes. So very interesting to me. And my curiosity is even further enhanced by this presentation by Laurent Audeguin. So I added in here, what's the total number of hectares in these countries? So you can see it's a drop in the bucket that are actually disease-resistant hectares of grapes. But when you go to Eastern Europe, it's much greater. Almost half of the plantings in Romania are considered to be hybrid disease-resistant types, about nearly a third in Hungary, Bulgaria, quite a significant amount. So, of course, curiosity leads to a little more research. And somebody had mentioned to me the PIWI organization, PIWI International. So I went online to find this organization. And this is an organization devoted just to the further dissemination of fungus-resistant varieties. Its membership is Eastern Europe, Western Europe. I believe it goes beyond those borders. I know of some New York individuals that are interested, maybe have joined this group as well by now. They're interested in the collection, the exchange of information about disease-resistant varieties. They're interested in encouraging the planting of these varieties and sharing information about how best to grow them, how best to make wine from them. So this is also happening out there. And everything I'm talking about is a result of classic hybridization, classic crossing methods as grapes have been developed for many years. So PIWI is out there. And now, let me spend a little bit of time on the situation in France. Then we're going to pause for questions, and then I'll complete the seminar with some additional comments about the situation in Italy and the situation in Germany and what's happening there in terms of the changing attitudes towards hybrid varieties. So in France, going back a little bit, only 60, 70 years, 1955, grapes were classified as either recommended, authorized, or tolerated. In 1970, a decree was passed that hybrids must be in either the authorized or tolerated categories, except Baco Blanc, which even to this day is a recommended variety for Armagnac brandy production. So it's a regional brandy production. So I have Baco Blanc pictured here, leading source of information on hybrid grapes in Europe, in a sense leading the charge, still out there after so many years. In late 1970, everything that was classified as tolerated was then classified only as temporarily authorized, replanting no longer permitted. 1958, you remember there were over 400,000 hectares. By 1980, less than 200,000. Today, even less. Then what about recent years? I found some numbers from a book by Kim Anderson, well-known economist, grape researcher from Australia. She counts in France, Baco Blanc, 773 hectares, and some other hybrids are still out there in pretty significant numbers. Chamboursin, over 1,000 hectares, Vidal Blanc, Viard Noir. So pretty interesting that these are still out there. That makes up, I think, a great deal of the 6,000 hectares that still exist. I'm not an expert in regulations, particularly in the European Union. I'm a breeder, geneticist, but I try to follow this story. It's so interesting to me. As here in North America, we have pretty free reign on what we can grow, where we can grow it. So I've been trying to understand the situation in the EU, and this very much relates to the adoption of new varieties. So since 2009, there were some regulatory changes that occurred about then. Wines may be made from grape varieties that are on the national list of authorized varieties. Approved varieties include those from vinifera or those now that are crossed with different species of vitis. And now we need some definitions here to go much further. PDO is a protected designation of origin, like Qualitätswein from Germany, Appellation Contrôlée from France, DOC from Italy, and PGI is a lower level classification, protected geographic indication. And then we also have the terminology DUS, is a new variety, distinct, uniform, and stable. So only vinifera varieties, according to the regulations, may be used in the PDO category, and hybrids may be used in the PGI category. Now, DUS evaluations are carried out by experts. These experts look to botanically classified new varieties as vinifera versus hybrid. So this is my current understanding. It may not be perfect. In France, in May 2016, the official catalog of varieties, this national list of authorized varieties, was opened for new temporary registrations. If the work on DUS had been done, you're allowed then to plant for each one 20 hectares at up to 10 different locations. If DUS is not done, only a maximum of 3 hectares. I'm not sure if that's 3 hectares per state or region in France, or 3 hectares total or per grower, but I could only find out this much. But clearly, again, hybrids can be planted. So 2017, just a year later, following the alterations to the regulations, 4 new disease-resistant varieties coming out of a breeding program in Colmar this breeding program released 2 reds and 2 white varieties, Artaban, Vidocq, and Floreal and Voltis, released by Christoph Schneider and Didier Murdinoglu at Colmar. These are now carried in the official catalog of Ontav. You can learn more at the website at the top of this slide. And in addition to the release of these new varieties, there's a great deal of interest in the different regions to develop local types. For instance, another cross is being made with these new varieties with Pinot Meunier for possible use in the Champagne district, or Syrah in the Rhone Valley. It's recommended by INRA that producers treat these varieties 2 to 3 times per year, which is a greatly reduced spray program, both to protect the resistance genes from being overcome by mutations of the fungus and to combat secondary diseases to which they do not have resistance, such as black rot. So here's an example of one of these new varieties, Floreal. This one is very interesting. It has 2 genes for resistance to downy mildew and 2 genes for resistance to powdery mildew. Run1 and RPV1 both come from the muscadine grape, but back-crossed over many years into vinifera background. So you really do not get muscadine characteristics in these varieties. So again, you can learn more at the website quoted up above. And you can also surf the web a little bit like I did. And there's a lot of discussion in French media. Here just from Vitisphere website. 60 growers in the Languedoc region ready to plant 80 hectares of varieties produced by Lambouquet, passed away in 2009. These are the Montpellier varieties. 2017, about a year ago, 12 new resistant varieties officially classified in the national, I presume this is in the national catalog. And here's an article about a tasting, a face-to-face-off between the wines of resistant varieties produced by a Lambouquet versus those produced at the Colmar station. These presumably the 4 that were just entered into the catalog and are being distributed now by Ontav. So this is where I finish up on France, and we invite your questions at this point.
Thanks, Bruce. That was awesome. Very interesting. It's pretty funny, the tolerated category is, we would never have anything like that here. I find that amusing. But yeah, let's give people a minute maybe to type in their questions in the Q&A, and we're ready for them. So Michelle sent us a question saying, do you foresee additional assistance in bringing some of these named resistant varieties into the US? For example, an expedited process from APHIS?
Okay, good question about, I guess you're asking more about, are they here now, or are they, is there interest in bringing them? So I'll be talking soon about some Italian varieties that are already here and available for sale via Novavine, a US nursery, which is associated with the French VCR nursery, Reisch. The INRA Ontav varieties, I believe they also have a partner. I don't recall the status of Floreal and Voltis, but I believe as opposed to being having resistance to bringing these in, I think there's been interest in bringing these in and testing them. A couple of years ago, I was at a wine tasting in Michigan, where many of these wines were imported from Europe to try due to the interest of Michigan grape growers.
Very interesting. Thanks, Bruce. So we have another question from Michael.